Good evening, y'all. Have you ever, in your life, ignored a red flag? Or maybe we call these warning signs. Whenever I think about ignoring red flags, one of the stories I grew up with somewhat is Pinocchio. And Pinocchio wasn't very good at all times at making decisions, especially good decisions. So who did Pinocchio have by his side? Well, on his shoulder specifically, he had Jiminy Cricket. And Jiminy Cricket was always encouraging Pinocchio to do what? He was Pinocchio's conscience. When Pinocchio would make a bad choice, what did Jiminy Cricket do? He'd say, "Are you sure about that, Pinocchio?" That's what he'd do. And every time he would kind of warn and give warning signs to Pinocchio, or at least he'd point them out to him. Well, a lot of times when we make decisions in life, there may be warning signs like Pinocchio that we choose to ignore. And you think about Pinocchio, eventually we'll wrap around back to this, but where did that lead him? What if he had just listened to those warning signs? I think we find a very similar story in Judges chapter 16. Please turn your Bibles to Judges chapter 16, and we will see 4 warning signs given to Samson. 4 signs that he ignores, and then number 5, we'll see the consequences. And what we should learn from this is that being a faithful Christian means being aware of spiritually negative influences rather than inviting them. I'll say it again. Being a faithful Christian means being aware and on guard of spiritually negative influences rather than inviting them. Let's start off in Judges chapter 16, verse 1 through 3. Here's our 5 points forgot to mention. Number 1, we see Samson's weakness. We're going to see her background, Delilah's. We're going to see her words, her actions, all these warning signs, and then the consequences of ignoring them. And we'll start off in verse 1 through 3 with Samson's weakness. Verse 1 through 3 reads, "Now Samson went to Gaza and saw a harlot there and went into her. When the Gazites were told, 'Samson has come here,' they surrounded the place and lay in wait for him all night at the gate of the city. They were quiet all night, saying, 'In the morning, when it is daylight, we will kill him.' And Samson lay low till midnight. Then he arose at midnight, took hold of the doors of the gate of the city and the 2 gateposts, pulled them up, bar and all, pulled them from his shoulders, and carried them to the top of the hill which faces Hebron." Now, what is his weaknesses that we find in these verses? Well, starting off really bad in verse 1, lust. The very first thing Samson does in this chapter is lays with a harlot. One of Samson's biggest weaknesses that we find in the 4 chapters we have of him is his lust for women. Us guys, whenever it comes to women, we have a tendency to become vulnerable and dumb. And that is exactly what happens to Samson when women enter the picture. And Samson knows this weakness. We even see it in a previous chapter. 1, lust. What is another one of his weaknesses? It seems like he gets himself in tough situations because of his pride. Because remember, God has gifted Samson with great strength. Samson often becomes prideful because of it and believes that he can just power through everything like he does in verse 3. But number 3, it seems like one of his weaknesses is also greed. You see this in a previous chapter where he marries a Philistine woman who ends up dying, but whenever Samson sees something, he just says, "I want that," and he takes it. And he'll just covet something, or he sees something that he really wants, he says, "Well, I guess I'm just going to take it." Samson was a pretty greedy person when you get down deep into his personality. What were his weaknesses? Women, lust. Samson's weakness was his strength. It was his pride. Another one was his greed. When Samson saw something that he wanted, what did he do? He took it. Samson was aware of his own weaknesses: women, pride, greed, specifically lust with that first one. And what does he do? We're going to see that although he's aware of them, he's going to choose to ignore that. Now, we see verse 4 and verse 5. Someone enters the picture of Samson's life, named Delilah. And we find her background in verse 4 and verse 5. Verse 4 starts saying, "Afterward, it happened that he loved a woman," that should set off warning signs, "in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came to her." This radar is going off. "And said to her, 'Entice him, and find out where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to afflict him, and every one of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver.'" So you see that a beautiful woman named Delilah comes into the picture. Warning sign number 1. And warning sign number 2, pride. Where does this woman come from? The valley of Sorek is the valley that connects the land between the land of the Philistines and the land of the Jews, or at this time, the Israelites. And you see that this woman herself was a Philistine. Now, why is this important to Samson in his life? Samson's number one enemy in his life was who? The Philistines. And where did Samson choose a wife from? The Philistines. That must have been some sort of warning sign, some sort of radar going off in his head. And what did he do with it? He ignores it. So you even find this in a previous chapter, just to give you all a little bit of evidence of this relationship. Just in chapter 15 alone, the word Philistines is repeated about 5 or 6 times. Specifically, going back up to verse 14 through 16, he fights the Philistines, and look at what it says in chapter 15, verse 14 through 16. "When he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting against him. Then the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and the ropes that were on his arms became like flax that is burned with fire, and his bonds broke loose from his hands. He found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, reached out his hand and took it, and killed 1,000 men with it. Then Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey, I have slain 1,000 men." The Philistines, put short, were Samson's mortal enemy in his time as a judge. And he just so happened to make a decision to take a wife from his mortal enemies. He chose a woman of those enemies, a woman who herself was greedy for money. Look, she's promised money in order to entice him. All these warning signs are going off, and even though Samson is aware of her background, he chooses to ignore it. Okay, so Samson knows his weaknesses, chooses to ignore it. He sees that this woman's background hits every single one of his weaknesses and chooses to ignore it. And then we find our next 2 points, her words and her actions. These two kind of go together, hitting each other back and forth in different verses. It's hard to put verses to these because it's sort of a pattern that you see. Every time she says words, her actions contradict them or contradict the well-being of Samson. Starting off in verse 6. So Delilah said to Samson, her words, she said to Samson, "Please tell me where your great strength lies, and with what you may be bound to afflict you." So that's her words. She asks him, which should be a warning, what's your weakness? Isn't that a weird thing to ask your husband? Like you'd think, right? But no. Samson says, and he really tests her here, but his action in verse 7 is, then Samson said to her, "If they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings, not yet dried, then I shall become weak. and be like any other man. Verse 8, so the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh bowstrings not yet dried, and she bound him with them. Okay, so there's the action. The exact thing he said would be his weakness, she goes and does. Okay, and then what happens? Verse 9. Now men were lying in wait, staying with her in the room, and she said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he broke the bowstrings as a strand of yarn breaks when it touches fire. So the secret of his strength was not known. Okay, so he tells her what his weakness is, which isn't really his weakness. And she does that exact thing. And then all of a sudden, these guys pop up in his house and try to attack him. You think that something is wrong here. Okay, well, that's not it. We keep going. We continue this with verse 10. We see that her words, she asks him what his weakness is, and then her actions completely betray him. But, Samson's prideful and he's strong, so he just moves on. Verse 10, more words. Then Delilah said to Samson, look, you have mocked me and told me lies. Now tell me what you may be bound with. Now, she starts doing a little something that we call guilt tripping. She says, she makes him the bad guy, and she says, you've mocked me, Samson. Is that really what's happening here? So he says to her, verse 11, if they bind me securely with new ropes that have never been used, then I shall become weak and like any other man. Therefore Delilah took new ropes and bound him with them, and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And men were lying in wait, waiting in the room. But he broke them off with his arms like a thread. I think we're starting to see a pattern here. Delilah asks Samson his weakness. He comes up with something, and she does it. There's something wrong with this relationship. There's something wrong with this influence in Samson's life, and he is ignoring it completely. Finally, verse 13 through verse 14. Delilah said to Samson, until now you have mocked me and told me lies. Therefore tell me what you may be bound with. And he said to her, if you weave 7 locks into my head and to the web of the loom. So she wove it tightly with the battern of the loom and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he awoke from his sleep and pulled out the battern of the web of the loom. Sorry, y'all. And so you see this pattern again and again, where she betrays him basically again and again, and he just ignores it. Her words, saying that she loves him, saying, hey, just tell me your weakness so that I can be closer to you, does not line up with her actions at all. And then you find this finally in verse 15. One final guilt trip, one final nail in the coffin that finally lets Samson go. Then she said to him, verse 15, how can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? Guilt tripping him even more. I imagine tears going down her face. Samson, why aren't you... It's ridiculous. She's guilt tripping him. You have mocked me. Has he mocked her? I mean, she just tried to kill him 3 times. I don't blame him. 3 times, and have not told me where your great strength lies. Verse 16, notice, this was not just a simple one-time thing. This was something that happened over time. And it came to pass, verse 16, when she pestered him daily with her words. Continuously, Samson, tell me. Maybe she guilt-tripped him every day, over and over and over again, until it says his soul was vexed to death. This is a serious thing. With her words and her actions, she has guilt-tripped him. And her actions have not lined up with what a good influence would be in his life. So what does he do? Finally, in verse 17 through 22, we see what he finally does. So that he told her, verse 17, with all his heart, and said to her, no razor has ever come upon my head. I've never cut my hair. For I have been a Nazirite to God. He took a Nazirite vow where he would never cut his hair from my mother's womb. If I am shaven, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man." Now, we've seen the pattern up to this point. And finally, Samson tells her the truth. He finally tells her, "This is what my real weakness is, Delilah." Now, based on what we've seen so far, what do we expect Delilah to do? Just forget about it? Do we not expect the same exact thing to happen? Well, somehow Samson didn't. Because in verse 18, it reads, "When Delilah saw that he had told her with all his heart, she sent and called for the lords of the Philistines." Same pattern. Saying, "Come up once more, for he has told me with all his heart." So the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money in her hand. Then she lulled him to sleep on her knees and called for a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. Then she began to torment him, and his strength left him. And she said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." So when he awoke from his sleep and said, "I will go out as before, as the other times, and shake myself free," but he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. Then the Philistines took him and put out his eyes, that is, pushed them in, and brought him down to Gaza. They bound him with bronze fetters, and he became a grinder in the prison. However, the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaven. So far we see that Samson has some weaknesses, right? Lust, pride, greed. And whenever something comes along, lust, pride, and greed, he completely ignores the warning signs. And whenever Delilah comes out of her way to literally do what is bad for him, when he could put her away, get her out of his life, he doesn't, and he keeps her there. So naturally, this has its consequences. When it finally comes down to it, Delilah betrays him and gives him into the hand of his enemy. She cuts off his source of strength, his hair, and God leaves him. So then what happens next? What are the consequences of this? Verse 23 through 31. Now the lords of the Philistines gathered together to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon their god and to rejoice. And they said, "Our God has delivered into our hands Samson our enemy." And when the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, "Our God has delivered into our hands our enemy, the destroyer of our land, the one who multiplied our dead." So what happened when their hearts were merry, that they said, "Call for Samson, that he may perform before us." So they called for Samson from the prison, and he performed for them, and they stationed him between the pillars. Now, notice, I'll read verse 26 and verse 27 as well. Then Samson said to the lad who held him by the hand, "Let me feel the pillars which support the temple so that I can lean on them." Remember, he can't see. He's weak now. Now the temple was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistines were there, about 3,000 men and women on the roof, watching while Samson performed. Okay, now what are the consequences of ignoring these red flags, of ignoring these warning signs? Well, 1, they blind him. Number 2, they chain him up. Number 3, they make him a mockery. They embarrass him. They make him into a show in front of all of their friends, in front of all the lords of the Philistines, his enemies. And where's Delilah? Off with her money. This is the consequence of Samson ignoring those red flags, those warning signs. And ultimately, this is how the story ends in verse 28. Then Samson called to the Lord God, saying, "O Lord God, remember me, I pray. Strengthen me, I pray, just this once, O God, that I may with one blow take vengeance on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." And Samson took hold of the 2 middle pillars which supported the temple, and he braced himself against them, one on his right and the other on his left. Then Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." And he pushed with all his might, and the temple fell on the lords and all the people who were in it. So the dead that he killed in his death were more than he had killed in his life.
And his brothers and all his father's household came down and took him, and brought him and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol, the tomb of his father Manoah, and he had judged Israel 20 years. Now the end of Samson's story is really sad. Now there is a little victory there at the end, but let me ask you this. What if Samson had just noticed the signs and listened to them from the very beginning? What if Samson had seen his weaknesses, seen the warning signs, and not jumped right into them, but done the opposite? What if Samson was aware of his weaknesses, had not married Delilah or been with Delilah, had not given into his greed, had not given into his lust? None of those things would have happened in his life. Samson would not have had to die in the temple of Dagon. Samson would not have had to have been blinded, would not have had to have been heartbroken by the woman who he loved. Why do I bring up all these things? What does these things mean to us? It's pretty simple. Just apply these points to yourself. Starting off with, we need to be aware and be watchful. Exactly what Samson wasn't. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8 says, "Be sober, be vigilant, for the devil roams around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour." We have an enemy out there. We know we have temptations out there, and we know that we can be prepared for them. Start off thinking about your personal weaknesses. What are the temptations in your life that make you weak? Samson knew what they were, and he ignored them. What are those things in your life? I always think of 1 John chapter 2, verse 15 through 17. A lot of temptations are summed up in 3 ways: the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, which all 3 you can apply to Samson and his lust, his greed, and his pride. You know yourself best. What does your flesh want that you know that you shouldn't have? What do your eyes see like Samson that you know that you don't need in your life? What does your pride say that may get in the way of doing the right thing? Do you know your weaknesses and choose to jump into them anyway? How about, we talked about Delilah's background, Samson knowing it, her environment. How about your background? 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 33 says, "Evil company corrupts good morals." This is said multiple ways in different translations. Do not be misled. Don't deceive yourself. Bad company corrupts good behavior. Another way, do not be deceived. Evil communications corrupt good morals. What's the moral of the story? What kind of people are you surrounding yourself with? Like Samson, are there people in your life that are just a glaring red flag? That are just a radar going off? What kind of goals do your friends have? What kind of motives do they have in being friends with you? What kind of influence are those goals and what they strive for and what you strive for in your life? Do you find that when you're around them, you find yourself compromising your own goals for theirs? How may they negatively or positively affect you? How about in what you hear? If someone is saying or talking about something that tempts you or that you know that is wrong, why are you still there? Why are you still having that conversation? If someone's involved in something and is talking to you about it that's wrong, get out. You don't have to stay in that conversation. Stop talking about it, whether it's gossip, dirty talk, whatever it may be. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 4 says, "Let it not even be named among you, associated with you." What? "As it is fitting for saints, neither filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor coarse jesting, which are not fitting, but rather of giving of thanks." Samson, you remember Delilah's words were a horrible influence on him in his life. They made him vexed to his soul and ultimately destroyed him. What words, what are you hearing in your life that may be a red flag, but also what you do. I think about James chapter 4, verse 17. Samson did not only let those words affect him, but it affected his actions and his sin. James chapter 4, verse 17 reads, now I'm trying to remember it, now it's leaving my head. James chapter 4, verse 17 is, when you know to do right and do not do it, it is what? Sin. That is exactly what happened in Samson's life. He knew to do right. He knew what he was expected to do, and each time he ignored it and did what he wanted to do. If those around you in your life, like Delilah, influence you to compromise your faith and your actions to do the wrong thing, you need to draw some lines. Some lines need to be drawn, and you need to say, I will not do that. Those are the kind of lines that Christians need to draw, the kind of lines that Samson did not. And finally, consequences. I want y'all to turn to Luke chapter 16 with me. When I think about consequences, I think about the rich man and Lazarus. But not just the rich man and Lazarus. If you remember in the story, the rich man had family. The rich man had brothers. If you remember, the rich man went to torments, and Lazarus went to paradise, to Abraham's bosom. Two different destinations. And starting in verse 27, the rich man in torments after his death is making one final plea. He says this in verse 27. Luke 16, verse 27, then he said, I beg you therefore, Father, that you would send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may testify to them, lest they also come to this place of torment. He says, please send Lazarus back to my brothers from the dead to preach to them, to warn them of where I am and where they're going. In verse 29, Abraham said to him, they have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them. And he said, no, Father Abraham, but if one goes to them from the dead, they will repent. But he said to them, if they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded, though one rise from the dead. What's the point? They have their warnings in their time. They know their weaknesses, and they know they have a guide with the law of Moses. And those warning signs are there for them to listen to. And in the end, the rich man and his regret for not listening to it couldn't have any effect on his brothers. They had what they needed and knew that they would be judged by it. And there were consequences if they did not listen, just like for Samson. What's the point? Don't let there be a day where you have regrets. Don't let there be a day when you say, if only I had listened. If only I had paid attention to the warnings. Instead, be aware. Be watchful. You know your weaknesses. You know the tempting environments. You know what things you need to hear and the things that tempt you. And most of all, you know the coming day of judgment. What you do now, the decisions you make, the signs you ignore, especially when it comes to temptation, reflect directly on your salvation. Overall, Delilah was a horrible influence on Samson. When she was around, the warning radars were going off. We saw this from his weaknesses, her background, her words, and her actions, and his consequences. Do you have anyone or anything like this in your life, and why? Today, we have a lot of decisions to make, some good and some bad. Many may have red flags or warning signs saying, I probably shouldn't be doing this. Just like when Pinocchio ignored Jiminy Cricket. And he turned into a donkey, and ultimately in the original story, he died. It's a simple thing. But the question for us today is, are there any warning signs in your life you may be putting off or may be ignoring? And if so, how can you change in order not to fall into future disaster? Today, if maybe you find that there are influences or wrong things in your life that need to be changed, or maybe you find that you have not been being as watchful and as vigilant a Christian as you ought to be, or that you have been ignoring those warning signs, or maybe you just need the prayers of the church, you are more than welcome to come forward as we stand and as we sing.